Okay, so in our third lesson here, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about functions. So in the past few lessons, we've been talking about this main function, which is the code that gets run when our application is run. It's the main entry point for our application. But today we're going to look at how we can write some functions of our own and call them from the main function, a little bit about the return values that we get back, and what we can do with that, as well as the scope associated with functions. So in our main function, as you can see, we have a return value of 0, but that is what it returns back to the operating system. In the case of another function we might write, we could return a different value, and we could use that value in our application. So we can return a value and assign that value to a variable. We can perform calculations with that value that we return from a function. So let's look at writing another function and how we can get a different value back from it. So if we want to declare another function, we can declare it in the exact same way that we declared our main function. So basically here, let's just return the result of a calculation. Let's specify two numbers and have this function return the result of a calculation. So we can see how we can manipulate the return values that we get from a particular function. So basically all that we've managed to do here is create a new function with a return type of integer, just like our main function, and tell that return to send back with this function a return value of 10 plus 20. So let's take a look at our main function and see how we can manipulate that value. So when we call a function that has a return value, we can use that return value in any way we want. So first, let's pass the return value from our function call here, from add function, into our main application. So let's call that function. And basically that's how we call a function that we've predefined. We simply just use the name of the function, similar to the way that it looks in the signature there. And now our variable function result will be the result of our function call. So basically what we specify as a return value is what gets sent back out when we call the function. So if we want to perform calculations and then return the result of those calculations to our main function to use them later, we can do that with the return value of our function. Just make sure that the type of data that you're returning is the same as the return type of the function. So int return types only can return integers. If you want to write a function that returns floating point information, decimal numbers, then you're going to have to specify that in the signature of the function. That's this line up here where we say int add function. So now let's print out the result of this function using our printf function like we have been. Again, just a reminder, we're going to need to use that %d symbol in order to print out a digit to the screen, and we use a comma to pass as another argument our function result. So once we've done that, we should be able to save our program and then run it and make sure that the appropriate result from our function gets returned. Let's just also add a new line so that's easier to see. So we can use make again. And then run our function, run our program like this. And as you can see, the result of our calculation from that function was stored in our variable first and then printed out using our print function. So let's take a look at some of the properties of functions and see how we can use them to perform some calculations and sort of organize our program, do some work within functions. So for our functions, we can pass parameters, which is basically information from whatever is calling our function. In this case, for right now, the main function is what's calling our function. And if we want to pass data to our function and have it perform some operations on that data, we can use parameters. In the same way that you see here, we use the printf function and pass it two pieces of data, both the print string that we're formatting it and the variable that we're passing to that string. We're going to pass some data to our add function. So we need to first specify the type of that parameter and then a name so that we can access that parameter within our function. So basically, let's say we want to add a parameter so that we can pass some data to our add function. It'll basically look like this. So now, when we call this function, we can specify a value for the variable number that's going to get passed down into this particular add function, and then we can perform some operations with that number. So let's say we want to return the result of whatever number we pass plus 20. So now here, we can specify whatever number that we want to pass for that particular calculation. So basically, the data that we pass when we're calling the function gets sent to the function, and then we can use that to do whatever we want. We can perform calculations, handle that data in any way that we need to. So let's write this program and run it. And now the result of our calculation with the value that was passed from the main function has also been printed out. So one point that's kind of important to remember when we're using functions is that we have sort of this idea of a function scope. So basically, the variables that we have are local to each function. And what that means is when you declare a variable within a particular function, it's only accessible within that function. So our number variable is a parameter for our add function, but if we were to change it, it would not change the result of the value that we pass. In this case, that's not a variable. But say we passed a variable from our main function down to the add function. And let's do that. And then say we attempt to perform some operation on the parameter that we pass to our add function, instead of returning a value. We attempt to increment our number that we pass, and on first glance it looks like this might change test variable to 31. But the way that functions work is the scope of that particular function is restrained to that function. So the number parameter that we pass to our add function stays within the add function, and the test variable that we declare in main stays within main. So if you want to change something, it's better to return a value. Although there are global variables. There are variables that exist outside of the scope of either function. So if you declare something outside of a function, you can declare variables outside of your main function, like something up here. It's accessible in all of the functions in your code. So attempting to make changes to it here will be reflected in all of the functions in your code. So let's take a look at that. So we've defined our global test variable outside of all of our functions, and then we assign it to whatever number we pass in add function, and that assignment should hold true in the main function. So basically, we should note that our global test variable should be assigned 40 instead of 25, because we're able to change its value inside the scope of our add function, because it exists outside of any particular function. So now we can run this program, and it'll print out 40 as opposed to 25. So from this, it's important to note that changes you make to the parameter variables that you pass down into your function won't be reflected in the larger scope from where you're passing them. So in order to update actual values of variables, it's better to return values. There is another way to actually mutate the values that you pass to a function later called passing by reference that we'll look at a little bit later. So for right now, let's make the add function take two parameters and add them together and then return the result so we can actually access it in our main function. And now we can run this program and ensure that it works. And the result of our calculation is printed out to the screen. So that's just a basic overview of how scope works in C. The variables that you declare only exist within the functions that you declare them. So in order to actually access values, you'll need to do something different. You can declare variables outside of a particular function and access them in all of the functions of your particular code or file. And that's basically an overview of writing functions and function scope in C.